Thank you both for joining. My name is Farzan Stabed. I'm a managing researcher at the Sanctions and Sustainable Peace Sub at the Geneva Graduate Institute, where I focus on Middle East security and politics, economic sanctions, and nuclear nonproliferation. I'm very happy to be joined by my colleagues, Decker and Sam. Care to introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Dick Rebeloff. I am currently a analyst at the Center for Naval Analyses in DC, which is a not-for-profit research and analysis organization, um, and a former member or former employee of the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. My interest is deterrence, missiles, capabilities, that kind of thing.
Excellent.
I'm Sam Blair. I'm a research associate at the Center for Nonproliferation Studies and a fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And my interests are broadly similar to Decker's, though I have slightly more of an interest in Cold War history as well.
Excellent. Excellent. Great to have you both on. So my kind of intersection with both of you in the, let's say, Middle East security and politics and slash Iran analysis world has been on the issue of missiles and drones, and specifically Iran's missile and drone program. And I thought it'd be great now that we're, 12 days into this war, to get an assessment. We could be near the end of the war. We could be midway. We could be, far. It could be far from over. Wanted to get your assessment on the performance of both what Iran's missile and drone strategy has been during the war, as well as the kind of performance of different aspects. Maybe some doing better than others. Also, keep in mind, it'd be interesting for our audience to kind of get a sense of this. The Islamic Republic in its rhetoric. I mean, most states tend to exaggerate. The Islamic Republic a little bit more than others. So it'd also be good to maybe get a little bit of a historical perspective in terms of what the Islamic Republic said about its capabilities, let's say before the 7th of October, after, especially, and then after again, Operations True Promise 1 and 2 in April and October 2024, respectively. After again, during the 12-Day War, and the kind of reality that we see today, what the gap between the rhetoric and reality is. Maybe Decker will start with you and then go to Sam.
Sure. So I think the natural point here is, our stopping point would be, I can talk about the basically all this that happened leading up to the war, and then Sam, who has been tracking the actual satellite imagery of the war much more close than I have, can talk about what's been happening and how this particular round of conflict has started. Right. So reaching all the way back to like 2020, right? We had the Operation Martyr Soleimani, which was Iran's response to the assassination of Brigadier General Soleimani in Baghdad. And that encompassed a small barrage of short-range missiles to against the American air base at Al-Assad. And at that point, they did pretty well during that initial strike period. They were pretty accurate as far as we can tell. It seemed like there was a lot of precision involved, or precision that was good relative to their capability and the access they had. And they made a big deal about this. I mean, the commander of the IRGC Aerospace Force at the time went on television, and he talked about basically the Iranian battle plan. And he made this big statement that, in the first 48 hours of a major conflict, they were going to kill 5,000 American troops, right? They made a series of very, very big claims about this capability. I think it was taken seriously, right? They had combat experience doing these kind of strikes. That seemed to be confirmed later when there were 2 rounds of Iranian strikes on targets in Erbil in Iraq, one of which was against a large mansion next to the site of the American consulate. I don't know if we ever got like a follow-up story on exactly what that was. The Iranians claimed it was a Mossad operation using that sort of mansion. And again, you saw very good accuracy, right? They launched a barrage of, I think it was like 8 or 10 missiles. And, you had 5 or 6 impacts that were dead on target, right? And so again, you had this this a lot of precision on display. Um, and then you get to True Promise 1 and 2. And there are a couple of notable changes, right? So first of all, you have gone from doing strikes that are, 200 kilometers in range, and you have then gone up to doing strikes that are like 2,000 kilometers in range. So already we have a dramatic expansion of the range involved here by a factor of 10, right? That's important because as your missile's flying along, um, you have small compounding errors in your guidance system. And as you're flying along, those errors are repeatedly compounding in very minor ways that add up to a large deviation from your intended target, right? This is likely compounded with some electronic warfare, GNSS denial, GPS denial that happened. And so what we saw in True Promise 1 and 2 was we didn't see the same amount of accuracy that we saw in previous rounds of strikes. They fired at a airbase in Israel twice. The first one is really interesting. The first one, the Israelis defended the airbase quite well with air defenses. And we saw a couple of impact zones on the borders of the airbase. And then you had True Promise 2, in which the Israelis just didn't contest. There was very little interceptor activity at the terminal phase, not the mid-course phase, but the terminal phase. Very little interceptor activity. And so what you got instead was you got like 40 different impact points across this airbase. And you could, with some, low confidence, basically estimations of intent target sets, you could do a very basic accuracy calculation, right? And depending on what kind of calculation you're doing, and also what kinds of target sets you're selecting and grouping, you're getting accuracies between, call it 300, 400 meters to the other extreme range of like around a 1K CEP. The 1K is likely not accurate. It's likely somewhere like within the 500 range if you were going to do that kind of calculation. And that is not a very good CEP for a precision missile system, right? That's just not good enough to hit particular shoot targets. And then I think kind of revealed, at least to the Israelis, that the Iranian missile capability was likely not as good as they had thought. I heard this from a couple of people who are, sort of plugged into Israeli politics and things like that. And, there was the general of the Israeli Air Force, if you want to television, said this, where it was like, I think he said that their attack was aggressive but imprecise. It's a very polite way of saying it. And so then we get to 12-Day War.
So, sorry, just a quick question there.
Mhm.
So the CEP, the accuracy is not very good. Is that somehow compensated for example, with very large or effective kind of warheads and kind of the explosive power it delivers, so as to make
Right.
so especially against hardened military targets that are also well defended in terms of air defenses?
Yeah, so it depends on the target set, right? For example, like for a HOS, a hardened aircraft shelter, you basically need to hit the target. You can't miss at all, right? And that gives you a lethal radius of a very, very low number. For civilian targets, you get a bigger lethal radius just because like you're not attacking anything hardened. The issue there is that you can't increase it too high because most of the missiles that Iran has been mass producing, probably for economies of scale reasons, are not quite as big as some other systems. And this has to do with basically like the industry of actually casting a rocket motor. As it gets bigger, it gets harder to do. So keeping your rocket motor as basically narrow as possible significantly aids your production rate.
The general principle you described, Farzan, right, where like increase in accuracy means that you could decrease the size of your warhead and vice versa, is genuinely true, right? We see this in the yield of U.S. nuclear weapons over time, where if you can improve accuracy, that's a better way to destroy a target because your yield scales with the cube root, and that kind of sucks.
Right. Yeah, yeah. It's and except for the Karam Jahar 4, which we will get to later when we talk about the last 2 days, we didn't see them use it that off those kind of missiles that often, right? Um, right. So then we get to the 12-day war, right? Just very quickly, like we had 12 days of conflict, um, and a lot of buildings that the Iranians said they would target, and they did indeed try and target, um, are still standing, right? So they targeted um, Camp Robin, which is the Israeli High Command Center. They targeted the headquarters of the Israeli intelligence. Um, they targeted a couple other of key Israeli government sites in the first 48 hours of the war. And due to a combination of Israeli missile defenses and just the plain inaccuracy of some of these systems, they didn't really hit any of them, right? And then as the war goes on, you see Iranian targeting shift a little bit from these smaller targets to these big industrial targets. Right, so they started to hit. They started hitting targets like the Haifa refinery, or less defended civilian scientific institutes. So Weizmann Center or Weizmann Institute, and a couple of technology parks scattered around Israel, right? But regardless of all of that, the key point I want to make here is that I think there was somewhat of a collapse of Iranian deterrence around the time of True Promise 2, right? And that sort of revelation that the Iranian systems were not quite as good as we thought they were, I think probably emboldened to some extent the Israeli actions during 12-day war and so forth. So that's how I would phrase it. We see that the Iranian systems were very, very good in certain circumstances and shorter ranges. As you get up in the range categories here, they become less effective at particular kinds of target sets. And then I'll pass over to Sam to talk about the current situation, because he's been following this imagery a lot more and how that's been going for just the entire region.
Just a quick follow question, just to hone in on what you said. Um, the shift in Iranian targeting that we saw during the 12-day war, was that a product of lessons learned, do you think, more during the True Promise 1 and 2, and a realization that we can't really effectively hit these military targets? Or was it just something that happened kind of mid-course during that war, or they kind of learned it before? And the other thing is, in Israel, you have military censorship, right? And quite effective information control. So the Iranians will make some claims. You'll see other claims circulate on the internet. We don't really have a good sense of to what extent maybe there were hits and there was some effectiveness. The, at least in True Promise 1 and 2 and the 12-day war, do you have a sense that they hit anything important outside of those, Weizmann Institute, Haifa Refinery, those kind of big pieces of infrastructure?
So there were a couple of military. First of all, there was the Haifa refinery, right? They hit that twice. There's a different refinery in southern Israel they also tried to hit, but I didn't see any impacts that were close enough to the refinery to actually damage operations. They did hit a couple of air bases some of the time, right? There were impacts there. It did not appear to be enough damage to actually impact operations, which is a key thing. You saw in the cell imagery before True Promise 2 happens, you start seeing the Israelis stockpile basically like repair materials at these repair stations they have on base, so they can very quickly just pave over everything that gets hit. There was some reporting that there was a missile attack on an air defense battery. I don't know if we ever confirmed that. If that was ever if it was an accurate damage assessment of what kinds of batteries got hit, if any, and things like that. But there were definitely impacts on a couple of Israeli air bases during the war. Yeah. And then on the targeting aspect, I think it happens intra-war. I think they tried to do their basic plan with the best field research they had at the beginning of the war. And then as it went on, I think they increasingly just started to try to look for where Israeli air defenses were weakest, right? And that's why you see Iranian targeting appear to shift from highly defended, government targets to them hitting repeatedly Beersheba, which is a city in southern Israel, that doesn't really have a major military presence in the city limits. But at that ending of the war, you start seeing the Iranians just hitting basically downtown Beersheba repeatedly. Because I think they judged it was in a zone where there just wasn't an air interceptor battery that was effectively positioned to defend that target set. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, they had that hospital there.
Yeah. I think they were trying. There's a technology park across the freeway from the hospital. And if you look at how it's azimuth, basically, it's quite clear that I think they were trying to hit that technology park, but the missile just overshot, right? I don't think they were intentionally trying to hit the hospital. I think they were trying to hit the technology park. They just overshot, right? It happens.
Yeah. Especially.
All right. So Sam, bring us up to the current war. I guess there's a number of names. Third or fourth Persian Gulf War. I think I've heard in Iran a name of the Ramadan War. We'll see what name ends up sticking. And it'll be interesting to get your sense not only in terms of I guess, was a medium range ballistic missile strikes on Israel, but also the performance of the shorter range missiles. And then we can maybe talk about drones. Because I think, and Decker, this is something we didn't really address in your part of the discussion, but it seems like drones, at least against Israel, were fairly ineffective, right? And Israel at least had the type of defenses where, at least coming from Iran, they were effective. Seems like that Hezbollah had more success firing drones from Lebanon and getting some hits on top of target, including, if I'm not mistaken, Benjamin Netanyahu's private residence in Caesarea.
Yeah.
Very good. Sam, sorry, go ahead.
No, not at all. Yeah, so I think what I have focused most closely on is basically the U.S. and Israeli air campaign against the Iranian missile force. And I think it's the kind of top line conclusion that I've taken from that is, by following along with this in the satellite imagery until access was kind of throttled by a lot of major providers recently. We can more or less see in real time the destruction of Iran's offensive missile capability. We were tracking damage to 22 different Iranian missile bases that cover both, regional and short range threats. And, this is reflected not just in the damage observed to base infrastructure and Iranian mobile missile launchers, but also to the kind of volume of Iranian offensive fire as well. So if you're following the CENTCOM commander's comments, they're talking about a kind of really dramatic decrease in the number of Iranian ballistic missile launches since the war has started. And I think that's a reflection of the success of the air campaign, right? The U.S. and the Israeli air campaign has really, started to reflect in how poorly the Iranians are now doing. But in terms of Iranian strategy, it seems like kind of picking up on what Decker said about the struggles that Iran had in kind of penetrating Iranian and Israeli air and missile defenses. It seems like two things are true. One is that the kind of regional range Iranian missile bases were pretty effectively suppressed at the start of the war. Right, one of the first big set of satellite images that we get is of the big regional range base at Tabriz North, where that was hit with bunker buster munitions, and a ton of those tunnel entrances are just totally collapsed. Right, that base was more or less inoperable relatively quickly at the outset of the war. And so the focus of the U.S. and the Israelis on those regional range bases initially kind of curtailed how much offensive firepower the Iranians could direct against Israel. But then also the Iranians adapted to the Israeli missile defense problem. And so during the 12-day war, they adapted with a targeting shift, right, where instead of focusing on those, highly defended areas, which have really effective terminal defenses, right? So Nevatim Air Base, for example, I did some research that showed that the terminal defenses were getting like 60 or 70% of incoming Iranian missiles, right, during True Promise 2. And if you move away from those military targets, you're not going to face as dense a missile defense problem. Um, and then the other adaptation are these cluster munition warheads that the Iranians are now using, probably on Khorramshaars, though we've seen the cutaways of them on the Ghadar missiles as well. And the advantage that these cluster munitions bring is that you circumvent the terminal defense problem, right? So there are several stages of missile flight, right? There's the boost phase while the engine is still burning. There's the mid-course phase where the missile kind of coasts through space. And then there's the terminal phase where it comes back down. And by deploying your cluster munitions, basically at the end of the mid-course phase, that means that you're kind of deleting the opportunity for terminal phase interceptions. And this has been really kind of a clever way to get around the terminal defense problem because it means the Israelis only have mid-course to shoot. And mid-course interceptions are kind of plagued with difficulties and are also very expensive, right? So the Israelis won't tell us the numbers for how expensive an Arrow 3 interceptor is, which is their mid-course interceptor, but it's probably in the ballpark of $4 million. And I'll bet a lot of money that your Khorramshaar 4 or your Ghadar with a cluster munition warhead is not $4 million. So there's kind of we see an adaptation in what Iran is firing. But the result of this as well is that the cluster munitions are not going to be super militarily effective, right? Especially against hardened targets, right? Even if they're hitting airfields, those are pretty easily repaired. The explosives are small, and you're not destroying the aircraft shelters. My understanding is that these are being targeted at kind of broader civilian areas, though, and that the goal is to kind of coerce Israel into backing off of the war, and that kind of coercive strategy, right, where these aren't necessarily intended to cause military effects; they're intended to produce political outcomes instead. That coercive strategy is also reflected in basically the missile conflict in the Gulf states as well, right? The Iranians are using their large and, as Decker was talking about, fairly capable short range missile arsenal to try and coerce the Gulf states into coercing the U.S. to stopping the war. And so, certainly we see a lot of U.S. military installations being targeted, right? Al Udeid, other places like that. Then we also see a bunch of, especially drone attacks against civilian areas, right? Like the skyscrapers and stuff like that. So it's interesting. The videos that I've seen have mostly showed, and the damage that we've seen from the Gulf states has mostly shown kind of ballistic missile impacts in military areas. And then usually when we see civilian damage, or at least what I've seen, that's been caused by drones instead, right? Like Shaheds or something like that. As far as military damage in the Gulf, the Iranians have hit some pretty high value things. It looks like they got a good whack in on a big fancy phased array radar in northern Qatar. And then they also destroyed a US ANTPY-2 radar, which is kind of the brain of the THAAD missile defense system. We don't have very many of those either. They're very expensive and hard to make. And so that's a pretty significant loss. So there's been kind of some degradation in regional, early warning and missile tracking capabilities. But I think that the pace at which the US and the Israelis have been able to suppress the Iranian missile force, that has outpaced, the damage that Iran has been able to do with its missiles and drones. And so that's kind of like the competition here. And it seems like the US and the Israelis are winning that race.
So this is something I want to dig in a little bit deeper. As you kind of said, Iran strikes, and I think this is something we saw starting in kind of Operation True Promise 1. We weren't 100% sure, but 1 and especially 2 onward. These weapons, at least against Israel, are not particularly militarily effective. they've been more militarily effective in and around the Persian Gulf and kind of within the range of Iran's short-range ballistic missiles as well as its drones. But still, the calculus seems to be to affect the kind of political determination of its adversaries, Israel and U.S., to continue the war by sapping the will of kind of these Gulf Cooperation Council countries, which had prepared to defend themselves, but not necessarily prepared for this type of war. Their calculation had been that by working for years and years to varying degrees to improve their ties with the Islamic Republic and to reach kind of détente, rapprochement, even cooperation on some issues, and to try to find an off ramp from the war, that they would avoid this, which they failed to do. So now it's happening. As you said, there's this race, kind of offense defense race, right? The Iranian calculus being, and they've said this explicitly, and I want to get your specific assessment on this question. What senior Iranian officials now, but before that, kind of Iranian experts who are briefed by Iranian officials had been saying is that the kind of goal is to drain the high-end missile defense systems, some of which are, I guess, presumably also being used against drones, by shooting maybe less effective weapons first, or lower end weapons first. And once that's drained, or the kind of the interceptor magazine and kind of other systems are significantly reduced, in some cases hit and degraded, that then Iranians will shift to using maybe higher end, better weapons to inflict much more hits. How do you assess that narrative?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is often referred to, this problem of, right, like, how do you mix in the levels of your high quality systems versus your low quality systems? This high low mix problem is, a really interesting one, and it's one of the kind of more dynamic elements of missile confrontation for sure. And I think going back to this idea of kind of coercive targeting and coercive signaling being part of these missile strikes, we actually do see this play out, especially in True Promise 1, right? Where the missiles that Iran used were kind of older Shahab 3 variants. And, we did not see a lot of wreckage or launches associated with the kind of higher end, either liquid propellant or solid propellant systems, right? Like no Karam Shars, no Khyber Shakans, no Fatah 1s, stuff like that during True Promise 1. And, that shifts during True Promise 2 and especially during the 12-Day War. But I don't know if that's necessarily the case this time. Maybe the Iranians are just firing, the bad stuff to kind of draw down interceptor stockpiles. That certainly could be true. But the other part of this is the U.S. and Israeli offensive end, right? Where if you waste all of your time at the beginning of the war launching your junk, you're probably not going to have any missile launchers left to launch the good stuff at the end, because they will have all been plinked by the U.S. Air Force. And so I think that's kind of part of the problem here is doing a high-low mix like that, where you're saving all your good stuff for the end, relies on this assumption that you're going to have launchers at the end. And the adversary is not inclined to let you have those launchers. So my sense is that if that is their strategy, it's not playing out for them very well. But certainly as far as kind of coercive potential goes, as you draw down those interceptor stockpiles, it's going to hit harder on the U.S. and the Gulf states, and definitely increase pressure to reach some sort of ceasefire or something like that. But the question is, can the Iranians continue to generate strikes? And that seems less and less likely.
Just maybe, Decker, this is also a little bit of a historical question, so maybe you can input this into your response. The Israelis, after the 12-Day War, claimed that Iran had about sort of like 500 launchers for the medium-range ballistic missiles, and that they'd taken out around half. We saw that narrative roll back a little bit in the autumn. I don't know where the final version of it stood, but it seems like that at least by the start of this war, the Iranians had significantly kind of reestablished their stockpile of launchers. So between medium-range ballistic missiles and short-range ballistic missiles, what's our sense of the kind of launcher math? Right? Are some of them are these launchers interchangeable, or are they really specialized to specific systems or specific categories? And then maybe you can also address, because I've seen you posting about this, to what extent during this war versus 12-Day War, the U.S. has been able to take out missile cities and kind of missile and drone stockpiles, or at least entomb them.
Yeah. I guess bring all that together. Um, I think the question of what Sam's about the missile strategy and what we can see from the launcher stockpile missile distribution, those are like kind of concepts. I'll talk about that, right? So, um, Iran has these underground bases. They call them missile cities, where they have a large concentration of firepower in a very deeply buried underground facility. And the advantage of this is that you have a centralized place that is largely immune to a lot of kinds of direct attacks. The problem is that you have a dispersal problem, right? So you have to get all your launch out of the tunnel into firing positions, direct the missile, fire the missile. And given the quality of Iranian guidance systems, there are some very technical things you have to do to make that work. That we won't get into at this juncture, but it can be very complicated.
You don't want to talk about theodolite Stecker?
No, I don't today. Sorry. There's a lot of math and stuff like that involved. But anyway, and one other thing about the missile cities is that, Iran's very big. I don't know if you noticed this before. Iran's very big. And so, what you can do is you can put your cheaper, shorter range systems closer to the Iraqi border and then have your nice stuff further away. And this creates something of a problem if you want to do an attrition strategy where you're firing off the cheap stuff first and holding the good stuff back, because the first things the Israelis hit in the 12-day war were those bases that were close to the Iraqi border that had all the cheap stuff in it, right? So you had to rely on either good stuff or old, very big liquids, right? And we saw that in 12-day war where after the last like 3 days were mainly like, old nodongs, which is the North Korean name for these basically supersized scuds, that were being fired from cities pretty far inland, right? And then, as for launcher regeneration, right? One problem is that I don't know if you noticed this, but when you looked at the Israeli comments that came out after 12-day war, some of them were like, "Oh, we have disabled X number," and some of them were like, "We destroyed X number." They have been clearer about that in this war, where there was an Israeli official that came on television in Israel that actually laid out like, "We have destroyed X number and disabled Y number." And the reason why that's sort of an important distinction is because, as I said, the missile cities themselves are very deeply buried. But if you hit all the entrances and seal up the missile city and they can't easily get themselves out, you have effectively disabled all the missiles in the missile city because you can't use them, right? And so there's this enduring question of, when we talk about the estimates for what kinds of things Iran has left, the counting has been made difficult by confusion about exactly how you count the possibly systems that were buried and then recovered, or systems that were straight up destroyed, by Israeli strikes, right? And we have seen they are losing launchers. We can see that via the both sat imagery and just like the CENTCOM briefs, right? So Sam has some great imagery of like where you can look at the missile base and you can see the destroyed launcher like on the road leading up the tunnel, right? Like, so we know they're doing this. But the way, I think the way that the Iranians laid out their missile posture with these missile cities generated a lot of unappreciated problems in how they operate. I think mostly because they just weren't expecting, during the 12-day war, such a sudden first strike, right? And that created a lot of problems for them, where they lost a lot of. They didn't lose air superiority technically from a technical standpoint, but like you saw the drones just flying overhead, um, and the Israelis did manage to basically create a system where there were large numbers of missile bases that were basically just like out of action effectively because they were just constantly observed by overlapping ISR systems.
Decker, just a quick question. Um, Presumably, this is a problem that the Agency Aerospace Force has foreseen. We have sense of their kind of operational time for reopening missile cities once they've been kind of in tune, and the difference between kind of the ideal time in kind of theory pre-war and then kind of the time that it actually takes under much more adverse operational conditions.
I don't know if we have any good data on that. Um, it took them, I don't know, like after the 12-Day War, we saw them unsealing the tunnels, right? And I will say also the other problem when you compare to from the 12-Day War to this war is that it appears that there are a lot of heavier munitions in play this time around. Like if you look at the damage being done to Israeli missile cities this time around, like it's an order of magnitude bigger than a lot of the stuff we saw during the 12-Day War. So I don't know. Yeah.
I'm aware that we wanted to bring Nicole on. If I could, I would take myself out and put Nicole in, but I think since I'm hosting the live, it's a bit tough to do. I'm just going to try to share an image from a colleague looking at kind of launches towards the GCC countries. Give me a minute here. Regardless of whether kind of Iran's promise strategy comes through, here's kind of the image. It seems like I don't think we have very good information on what the GCC countries interceptor magazines where they stand and how quickly they're being drained. Iranian attacks are coming down, but it seems like when they want to, they can hit military targets, critical infrastructure, energy targets, civilian infrastructure. I'll also add this data comes from the various governments. It's been collated by my colleague Mark Gustafsson from Eurasia Group. Yeah, so you know, is there any point, do you think, where we're going to see Iran's missile launches and drone launches fall off even further than they have until now? Or are they going to be able to maintain the current operational tempo, which is presumably going to pose a problem both for the U.S. and for the GCC countries?
So it's harder to say in the Gulf context, right? Because there are shorter ranges involved, and there are a lot of facilities in that sort of southern reach of Iran, where they have shorter missiles that were not used last time. That's also a key thing, right? Because those missiles along the southern coast of Iran don't have the range to reach Israel. And so this is the first time we're seeing them basically operationally used. Whether or not, I mean, I think they will continue to slowly go down. Um, for some things like drones, it's going to be a lot harder. Because drones are just so easy to set up and launch, and so easy to make, and they've made them for a long time now. Um, um, but we'll see. I think that if the question was rephrased to be like, well, do you think they could do it? Could they do this for long enough that it would actually exhaust GCC political will? I don't think so. So far we've been seeing the opposite effect in the GCC, where it's more like a lot of Saudis getting really mad about like what they've been doing for the past 5 years. Now it's all gone to smoke. Um, um, but we'll see. Yeah, Sam.
Yeah, I think I broadly share this assessment. I don't think I don't think that launches will kind of go off a cliff. I think that it will kind of be a gradual decline as launchers continue to be destroyed and the supporting infrastructure that enables launches continues to decline. But I will say that the kind of persistence of launches does reflect the success of one of the adaptations that the Iranians took to the successful decapitation strikes, which was this mosaic strategy, which I know Nicole can talk, in much more detail than I can, and Decker, I'm sure, can as well. So yeah, I guess before I hop off, what I'll say is that, yeah, I think the number of launches will kind of continue to steadily decline. I'm not sure if it'll be kind of like a jump step thing. I think it'll be
Steadily over days, weeks, months.
I mean, the timetable depends more on the president than I think than anything else. Um, but yeah, the other thing I want to underscore is that this is all enabled by the total failure of Iranian air defenses, right? The fact that you can have MQ-9 Reapers post up over your missile base and either Hellfire your transporter erector launcher itself, or queue up long range precision strikes. CENTCOM was sharing videos of HIMARS launchers in Bahrain using precision strike missiles to destroy, illuminated missile launchers in Iran. And yeah, if you allow the enemy to set up that kill chain, then you're going to have a really bad time. And so while, yeah, we can't dig out the missile cities, we can just destroy things as they come out of them. And I think that really is the kind of the failure of the missile city concept. But yeah, I mean, I agree with Decker, right? I think this will be gradual, and then I think it will. I think the Gulf states are just more likely to be angry about this than pressured into uh, into encouraging the U.S. to stop. All right, I'm going to bounce that. Oh, sorry.
One last, actually, quick fire round, just a very quick if possible. I think the lower end goal that's been articulated by both President Trump as well as the Israeli government has been to significantly degrade Iran's military capacity. We saw that Iran was able to actually significantly recover during the kind of 8-month window between the 12-day war and this war. Not completely, but to a significant extent. Putting aside kind of some of the economic considerations, which will have to be sorted out later. After the level of strikes that we're seeing now, including on kind of the military-industrial complex of Iran and its various kind of supply chains within the country, anyway. What's your sense of its ability to recover from this war, potentially before a future round of war happens, right, in 6, 9, 12 months?
Well, so what I saw in the satellite imagery was that a good example is at Sharud, which was only struck at the end of the 12-day war. It took about 3 to 4 months for that facility to be repaired and be more or less fully operational again and be producing missiles again. And so that's a really quick turnaround time. But also, I think it reflected how kind of light the damage was. And other facilities that got hit harder took much longer to recover. And so I think that from a defense industrial perspective, this is recoverable, right? The knowledge still exists in Iran of how to build ballistic missiles, and I don't think you're going to be able to kill every single rocket scientist in Iran. And also, books still exist, and people can learn this. So the kind of potential for a program still exists as long as you have an unfriendly regime. And it's unclear to me that mowing the grass is going to fundamentally resolve that threat. But yeah, it's going to take some time to reconstitute, and it also relies on some willing partners, right? There are key components like planetary mixers. Think really, really sophisticated KitchenAid for producing solid propellant rocket motors and things like that. And so you need someone to be able to sell you those, and you need to import the raw materials. But as far as industrial capacity goes, that can be rebuilt, and it could probably be rebuilt in a year or so. The damage to the missile bases is much more extensive than the 12-day war as well, in terms of the number of bases hit and the severity of the damage, as Decker was saying, right? I think much larger bunker buster munitions were used, and that probably reflects the U.S. Air Force's involvement. Right, we have bigger bombers and can put bigger bombs on them than the Israelis do, um, and so that damage is going to take longer to recover from. So, like on a fundamental level, is this reconstitutable for the Iranians? Yes. Will it take longer than after the 12-day war? Absolutely. Um, this is, but these things require political solutions rather than military ones.
Thanks so much, Sam. Really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah.
I'll,
Thanks for having me.
hopefully we can do this with you again soon.
Yeah.
So
Agreed.
we'll bring in Nicole now. Once again.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'll just keep talking with. Yeah, I agree with Sam. Where last time in the 12-day war, we saw the Israelis mainly try and target the mixers themselves, right? This sense that like if you take out these planetary mixers, where you can't mix the propellant anymore, you can missile program. And they share some other sites as well. But the mixers, they can be replaced. You can buy those from a variety of Chinese companies, and you can import them pretty easily. I mean, it's not legal, but easily. And other raw materials. Um, um,
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, Nicole.
I'm in my
Thanks for
bunker.
joining us. Good.
But in this war, what we're seeing right now is that the scope of the targets for the supply chain for missiles has dramatically expanded. Right, so we're seeing a lot of facilities that weren't hit in full day war, and they're being hit pretty hard. Right, so now it's a question of not can they reconstitute one supply chain. It's a question of can they reconstitute 5 or 6 different supply chains. Right, the guidance supply chain, heat resistant material supply chain, propellant supply chain, all that stuff. Right, and that is just by just that's going to be a lot harder, right, for them to reconstitute. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm not sure if Nicole, if you're able to speak right now. I know you.
No, I was able to speak. Yeah, sorry.
Okay, excellent. So you've been listening all along. Maybe if people don't mind, we'll extend this another 10 minutes beyond the time we were supposed to finish, so we can give you a little bit of time to kind of speak.
Whatever works.
Do you want to comment on anything you've heard or some of the questions so far, and add your thoughts where you think there might have been some gaps?
Well, I mean, I think Sam and Decker were like really excellent on the way that they were talking about this. I mean, I just wanted to say actually when I was listening, but I wasn't fully listening because I had to do my dishes. Sorry. Um, but I just wanted to say like this is such a great opportunity and it's nice that we're all like here together and able to talk about this because this is a really important time to bring in experts together and stuff. And so thank you so much, Farzan, for organizing this. I don't have much to comment on the Sam and Decker part with missile like bases and the missile cities and some of their assessments of the missile side of it, but happy to talk on anything else.
So I actually, this is a good segue. So from the point that Decker and Sam were making about the kind of greater difficulty Iran will face this time around reconstituting its ballistic and probably its drone program as well. I think there was a report from Bloomberg. I might just put it up quickly while you're talking, just about the level of damage. Do you have any sense? So maybe give us a sense of where Russia-Iran relations stand. What kind of support Russia has been providing, what it's providing during the war, and what are some of the possibilities of what it could do after?
I mean, like the Russia-Iran relationship is quite a strong relationship in terms of like defense cooperation, but it's not an alliance. I mean, you have Iran supplying Russia with the Shaheds, and I think the report from CNN today showed that maybe the Russians were helping Iran with, I guess, kind of the operational side of using these UAVs. Uh, I wouldn't say that like Russians are involved in this war by any sense, but it does show that Russia has used some of their battlefield improvements in Ukraine to potentially be useful when it comes to Iranian operations right now. Um, Iranian production of shot. Well, I mean, I think I don't know if Sam and Decker covered this, but with production of UAVs and drones, it's not as it's harder to identify than ballistic missiles. You could do this in a civilian facility. It's a lot of dual use parts. But what I think is interesting on the Russia-Iran angle is that we don't know. We have not been able to see like the forensics inside of some of the Shah heads that have been used in this war. But I would be very interested to know if like any upgrades were like that. That's like kind of what I want to know. This is like I mean, there's a lot of things I want to know about this war, but the one thing I really want to know is if the components within the Shah heads that were used in the Gulf actually contain upgrades that maybe reflect the fact that the Russians have provide that to the Iranians. Because I think not the radar, the targeting issue is like one thing, but actual physical like evidence of this is like super interesting. And it's kind of like what I would find quite interesting, I guess.
Yeah, there's a lot of individual components that the Russians have been basically perfecting for the last 3 years or 4
Yeah.
years now. They have been installing in their Shahed copies. And the big question is, well, have those made it over to back to the Iranian side, right? So stuff like uh, GNSS denial, basically
Yeah.
pass through ships. So the Russians have a system called the Kometa M, which basically just queries every GNSS satellite over and over and over again and filters for noise. That's a capability that would be very, very useful to the Iranians. Although I will say, they seem to be doing a pretty good job already, right? They've been doing some pretty precise targeting. So,
Well, I mean, one thing that I do think is a shift from the Operation True Promise 1, 2, and 3 is the targeting. I mean, like, what is interesting is seeing Iran like vigorously trying to go after radar, whereas they haven't really done that in like the other iterations of the True Promises. And so for me, that's like, okay, what has changed here? Like, where's the Iranian? Where are they going? Like, did the Russians help here, or was it just learning on their own? I don't know.
There was a report by, I think it was Conflict Armaments Research a few years back, where they had found one of the Shahed models, might have been one of the earlier models, not the 149, where they'd kind of assembled it. I think it was from a battlefield in Yemen or somewhere else, and they basically found that this thing was some huge percentage. I forget if it was like 85% or 90%, basically U.S. components, and then the actual Iranian components were like maybe 5%, right? So there was kind of a curiosity about the Shahids that the Iranians are using now. How much more capable are they? How have the supply chains shifted? Something else interesting. This, Nicole, you remember this because we talked about it at the time. There was this big alleged leak of Russian documents that included kind of various
Yeah, I know.
exactly documents. There, they had some Shahed variants with specialized kind of roles, right?
The
I don't know if
dolphins.
dolphins. Yeah. Well, I'm not actually sure if any of if during this war, for example, some of the Shahids that are like are supposed to be jet, right, and it's supposed to be much faster. Some of the ones that are supposed to be much more focused on taking out kind of air defense infrastructure. I'm not actually sure if any of the Shahids that were in those alleged leaked Russian slides uh, have made it materialized on the battlefield specifically during this war. Do you have any sense of that? And people search just one thing. People can go back on my Substack if they search like leaked documents or something. I did a big write up on the pieces of that leak that I thought was interesting. So
I think you shared with me those documents because I was too scared to download them on my computer. So
well, I downloaded them without protecting my computer. I went raw, and but nothing has happened as far as I'm aware. So
I mean, I don't want to. I mean, Decker might know this better than I do, but like I have been very careful about making assertions about like what we know and what we don't with like the perform. I mean, there's been videos that have come out, but we don't know for sure like what systems were being used. Like I don't know. I mean, maybe Decker and like the OSINT, like the real like guys who do the real technical stuff can tell, but I haven't been able to see a differentiation really. I mean, like you can see what a Shaw head looks like. I haven't been able to tell the difference between the various variants of them.
yeah, I mean it's very difficult to tell, partly because most of the footage we have is through like a Apache gun sight. So it's hard to tell exactly what the variants are going to be. And then there hasn't been a lot of as we said, debris analysis, right? So the Gulf states appear to be happy to say that they've intercepted X number of drones, but they haven't been releasing any debris or anything like that, which is quite frustrating. Yeah.
Do we buy the numbers from the Gulf?
I mean, I don't know, right? They could be accurate, they could be inaccurate. Um, I also don't know how exactly they're counting intercepts, and things like that. So, um, yeah, I don't know.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's tough to know. Maybe one question here. This will maybe start going a little bit into the more air defense space, which is further
Shannon should have been.
further out.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry about that. Uh, how quickly can the GCC countries with U.S., Israeli, Ukrainian assistance surge in anti-drone defenses? Right. My understanding is that that's less of a question of like days and weeks and more of months. Right. So how to what extent is that something that can be this vulnerability that can be cost effectively patched and quickly?
Um, I don't know, right? So like for something, it's very easy. So like an Apache is a very easy. It's just these use it's chain gun basically. Um, and then you've got your F-16s, which is going to be again either the gun or just a sidewinder. For the more specialized anti-drone systems, the problem is that those are a lot of them are so not quite experimental, but more like still in the early phases of production that like it's kind of difficult to find any lying around, right? Um, so whether or not they can find any of that and deploy it quickly is unknown. The other problem again is that like it's also a training aspect,
Mm.
right? Um, it's also used to train your soldiers on the system itself, and use it effectively. And so I don't quite know. There has been talk of getting Ukrainian experts out to the Gulf um, to advise on basically best ways to counter the drones as with the tactics involved. Um, there is quite a lot of tactics in how you deploy and structure your drone waves. In some, the Iranians could not be using that at all. Um, but there are tactics there. Um, so yeah, I don't quite know.
Just to maybe summarize the discussion, and then we can put in a few concluding remarks over the next few minutes, because I'm also cognizant that I may have told our East Coast audience the wrong time. So that, again, apologies, apologies on my end. So some may be joining now who thought they were joining at the start of this, but the recording will be available. So just to summarize, that there was a significant degree of exaggeration about Iranian capabilities ahead of the 7th of October, leading into Operations True Promise 1 and 2. Once we get to the 12-day war, we have a much more, much more realistic grasp of what those capabilities are. It seems that during the current war, the medium-range missiles have been maybe even less effective than they were during the 12-day war as kind of a category and a major threat, at least when Israel has been able to put together this kind of very robust defensive effort, including significant U.S. assets, such as aircraft carriers. But the short-range ballistic missiles and Iranian drones have been quite effective. Iran has basically used what for a long time was seen as its nuclear option. I mean, besides actually building and deploying a bomb, right, a nuclear weapon, right, its nuclear option was to disrupt global energy traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. it's effectively done that without physically closing the strait by kind of manipulating the risk perception of the private sector through being able to maintain attacks. Those attacks are decreasing over time, but not at such a rate that the threat from perspective of global energy will be nullified anytime soon. And in the meantime, they appear to be able to continue to hit targets with some somewhat relatively effectively, including military targets, critical infrastructure, as well as energy infrastructure and targets. Would you guys agree with that summary? And so it's kind of comes down then to a question of political will on the one hand, either to continue the war or reach a ceasefire and negotiate, and at the same time, um, I guess the ability of the U.S. and its allies to potentially put in countermeasures to try to bring down global energy prices. If this threat is somewhat nullified through a contribution through a combination of both degrading Iranian offensive capabilities as well as putting in those countermeasures to better protect and kind of restore the flow of energy traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, that kind of maybe I guess expands the horizon through which the U.S. can continue to conduct strikes, right? Because at that point, what other effective offensive means do the Iranians have left?
The one thing I think we haven't touched on that I think is important to talk about, I was asked Nicole about this, is the, I guess, change between the 12-day war and the current conflict, where we see, as far as I can tell, a larger embrace of the Mosaic model of operations. Um, 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 and just how the IRGC is compensating for the fact that um, their highest level of command control has been effectively disabled.
Yeah, that's like the most for me, one of the most interesting parts about this war. That whole kind of I think I said this to you guys after the 12-day war was like, oh, maybe Iran wasn't so foolish by actually dispersing parts of the IRGC command because basically they didn't concentrate everything on the western borders like after the Iran-Iraq war. Obviously not the same for some of the missile cities and stuff like that. But it's unclear. I mean, like what we're seeing right now in some of like the weird operations where you get like one missile launch and like not really a follow on, like that is maybe a question of like, is this regional delegation or is this actually just like a failed launch? I don't know. I mean, that stuff is like kind of unknown at the moment. Um, but I mean, to Iran's credit here is like I do think that it was a smart thing to do the Mosaic defense like around 2000, what, 3, 5, like kind of when they started thinking about this.
Mm.
What one thing is like they never really focused on the East, and like this is like something that's persistent in this war is like the East is not being targeted as much. And if you're thinking about like kind of hardening facilities in the future without air defenses, like why don't you think about the territory that wasn't targeted in the 12-day war, but is not being targeted right now? Is this where you're going to build up? I don't know. I can't like make that like assessment at the moment.
Right.
But the Mosaic defense doctrine or the Mosaic defense like strategy and stuff, um, I think it actually worked. I mean, like I'm gonna go out on the limb and say like I think that to some extent this actually worked and actually did what it was intended to do. Is like not many countries envision a scenario where their leadership is decapitated. I mean, like, this is not something that the United States or like, I mean, even Russia, for example, has that level of like regional delegation. I mean, obviously, the Russians do this to some extent, US does to some extent, but like Iran, like pretty much is letting the regional commander be autonomous at this point. It's kind of remarkable in terms of like delegation stuff. Um, like so, that's the thing is like what Iran is doing right now is probably going to be a really interesting case study for when we think about like military operations when you have a decapitation scenario. Um, I don't know what's happening up right now because the KCHQ is like taking a lot more authority than actually the IRGC.
You wanna say what the KCHQ is?
No, Khatam al-Anbiya. It's like the basically combined command, like headquarters, pretty much. It's basically combatant command headquarters.
And how does that differ from the Defense Council that was kind of reactivated after?
Gosh. Iran has like 15 different parallel councils that all deal with defense. But KCHQ was originally in charge of the IRGC command, and then they moved it to be kind of a parallel command of the general staff, but subordinate to it. And this is for the large scale operations. So this is like where you're using different parts of the IRGC armed different services. So IRGC Aerospace Force, IRGC Navy, or Artesh as well. But this is basically for like a joint operation, pretty much, and they're in charge of that. General staff has been very silent during this war, which is really interesting because there was a concerted effort to make the general staff a lot more streamlined and to take that authority position. And so now you see KCHQ coming out and being the ones who are making statements. Not even IRGC, by the way. It's not even like the IRGC. So that's interesting. And from my understanding, Mojtaba has a close relationship with KCHQ. Rumors, I don't know. But yeah, just the way that the Iranian military is going right now is just really, it's just an interesting case study. I don't know. I mean, I don't know how many times we'll have an opportunity to study something like this in terms of so many parallel structures, but also this huge level of decentralization going on.
So,
I don't know
something
if
that like people
sorry.
no, makes sense. So I think the Mosaic Doctrine was designed after the Iraq War with kind of two functions in mind. One was specifically based on the experience of the invasion and occupation of Iraq, and how to confront a superpower, right, as kind of a middle power with limited resources and capabilities, when there was that kind of military kind of overmatch. So there was this kind of hard war that they were looking at, but they were also looking at soft threats, such as, for example, color revolution, right? That's something which was very much in vogue. And you, and Nicole, having said Russia, this will certainly kind of resonate with you as also part of the Russian discourse, as far as I understand it. And so the idea was to create these kind of regional and provincial commands who could, where authority could be delegated to them. And they could also serve as fusion nodes between different elements of either war effort, counter protest response, disaster response, right? And it's kind of evolved over time. I'm not sure if in its original conception it was designed for this type of decapitation strikes, simply because that wasn't really the case at the time it was set up, where you were able to get such precise information and kind of carry out precise strikes to decapitate political and security leadership in such a way on such a scale, right? But I think after the 12-Day War, that was a specific adaptation that was made, where we started hearing this, I think, September onward, where first was Pezeshkian, then it was the head of the spokesperson for the National Security Council, where they basically said, all the sensitive political and security figures were told to appoint kind of 3 to 5 successors. Some people said 3, some said 4, some said 5. I think the number we've landed on is about 4, right? So that it was, the chain of command was clear, the chain of succession was clear, and so the vacuum of authority was kind of minimized in such a crisis. And I think we can say it worked. One thing I'll say about the multiplicity of agencies, it does build in a degree of redundancy into the system, but I think it's also a symptom of a certain type of Iranian disorganization and inefficiency. In Persian, one of the expressions we use is like hayati, where they're, okay, like, let's do it here, and then let's do it there. They have all these different bodies. And actually, a lot of the time, what the actual practice will be, you won't necessarily be able to determine in advance. It'll kind of take shape based on what's there during a crisis, right? So I would have imagined that now that this defense council had been stood up, that it would have played much more of a role in coordinating the war effort. But like you said, it seems to, and it was decapitated very quickly at the start of the war, and now it seems like it's the KCHQ that's doing much more.
Well, I thought the Defense Council was useless when it was first created anyway. So I can come out and say that they should have listened to me at least if they were trying to think about some stuff. I mean, really, it was. I mean, the Defense Council, the Supreme National Security Council, like those roles were very much overlapping, and it just kind of felt like, why are you having a more redundant structure when you have two parallel militaries and you have a general staff and you have a mini general staff, and then why do you have to make this so much more complicated? And
Yeah.
yeah.
There was a lot of discussion around that. One of the things we heard was that, for example, the National Security Council was maybe much more responsible for broad national security coordination, both in terms of internal security as well as foreign policy, building consensus around Iran's negotiating positions. The kind of that broader aspect of it, and the Defense Council would be much more narrowly defense focused, and that it was also reflective of a kind of political division of labor, right? With Ali Larijani, the Secretary of the National Security Council, having that at his position, and then Ali Shamkhani, who I'm not sure about the relationship between the two. I've heard things to the effect that they were not quite good, but having the Defense Council and this kind of narrower mission being delegated to him, and also showing kind of dispersing power a little bit, so it wasn't overly concentrated in one person. But like you said, in practice, it didn't end up amounting very much. Any closing remarks before we log off? We've kept it around very long.
No, this was great, and I think, Farzan, you should definitely continue this because, you've really been, like, a central node for a lot of the people who study Iran, and, like, I really appreciate you bringing us all together again. I mentioned that when I joined, but I think this is great, and thank you so much for doing this.
Any last words, Decker?
I think this is valuable. I think this is valuable. Thank you for having me. Yeah, we should just again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Nicole, for those very kind words. I really appreciate it. It would be good if, we have, we're connected to a very broad network of both experts of Iran, different sub issues within Iran, as well as specialists who could shed a lot of light. We've talked about ideas of doing various things. So hopefully this is a first step towards more of these. And in some cases, hopefully one of you will be the lead. And Sam. Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
You have a great one.
Yeah.
Bye.
How do I get out of it?